Greetings to you wherever you are in the world. My name is Wendy Osborne, Senior Consultant with IAVI. And on behalf of IAVI and the Emirates Foundation, I am delighted to welcome you to this first session in our virtual Global Forum series. Today, we've had over 500 people register from 88 countries. Truly a global event. The COVID-19 pandemic has emphasized how volunteers as agents of change provide the practical action that builds hope and resilience, improves lives and strengthens communities. The pandemic resulted in the postponement of the October 2020 IAVI World Volunteer Conference to be hosted by the Emirates Foundation in Abu Dhabi. The conference will now take place in the autumn of 2021. However, the conference theme chosen for 2020 of volunteering together to enable change and create a better world has never been more relevant or more real. It seemed fitting to give this forum series that same title. As part of the preparations for the conference, the Emirates Foundation had agreed to support the writing of 7 context papers on the conference sub-themes. This project has continued with the aim to provide greater consideration of important issues, particularly with relevance to volunteering and COVID-19, and to enable wider dissemination of knowledge that will add value to those supporting and developing volunteering around the world. The context papers will be published and available between July and December 2020. The publication of each of these context papers is aligned to the series of virtual global forums. I would like to pay tribute to Alice Chadwick and Bianca Fadel, co-authors of the context paper associated with today's forum. It is an excellent piece of work and I commend it to you. We hope the forums will be of interest to volunteer involving organisations, academics, policymakers, corporations, volunteers, and indeed anyone interested in volunteering. A copy of the relevant published context paper will be provided to each person who registers for a forum. Following each webinar, the paper and the forum recording will be made available to anyone interested. Now we move on to some technical information. On the screen, you will see an overview of the meeting room controls. There are 3 points to highlight. 1, if you're having trouble with your computer's audio, try using your phone by selecting phone call under the audio tab. 2, there is a small hand icon on the control panel. During the session, you may be asked to raise your hand to provide non-verbal feedback. This is the icon to press. And thirdly, and most importantly, there will be a question and answer session as part of this forum. So send in your questions by using the questions tab. No need to wait to pose questions. You can write them at any time. As I said, this forum series, there will be 7 webinars between now and December. So please check out the dates and put them in your diaries. Today's forum is on the topic of volunteerism and community resilience, locally owned solutions delivering impact. Having spent over 35 years working in the field of volunteering, I've always known that individuals through their volunteering make connections, build networks and stakeholder relationships, aid communication and support cooperation, vital components for community resilience. It is an issue that is relevant and very topical as the world addresses the common challenge of COVID-19. I am therefore delighted that today's moderator comes with the right experience and expertise to lead us through the rest of this forum. Sarah Henderson is currently Resilience Advisor at VSO and has spent a number of years supporting projects across Africa. She has a master's degree in international human rights and humanitarian law from the University of Essex. I also happen to know that during the pandemic, while having to return home from Africa to Northern Ireland, she has been actively involved as an emergency response volunteer with the British Red Cross. I take this opportunity on behalf of IAVI and the Emirates Foundation to thank you, Sarah, and our other distinguished panel members who are giving input to the session. I know it is going to be a great one. So Sarah, it's now over to you.
Thank you very much, Wendy, for that introduction and your very kind words. It's certainly a very interesting series of forums that we have coming up, and I'm excited that we are starting off that series by discussing volunteerism and community resilience. So what are we going to be talking about today? We're going to be talking about the alignment of emergency resilience activity and broader community resilience work, recognizing that building resilience within communities is about engaging communities in considering the challenges that they face and also supporting them to own and lead the process of building resilience. We also know that the people power of volunteers is really key in helping to anticipate and challenge issues. It supports ownership and responsibility. It helps identify novel solutions, and it helps to give leadership to work towards transformational change. It's going to be a very exciting discussion today. I really hope that you've all had the opportunity to read the fantastic paper which has been prepared by Bianca and Alice in advance of today. But don't worry, if you haven't yet had a chance to look at it, they're going to take us through a summary of the content shortly, and the paper will be available to everybody after today's session. So just a short introduction to sort of my work and how this relates to the topic. In VSO, we're an organisation that is working to empower communities, looking at embedding resilience in all of our programmes across education, health and livelihoods. We recognise how important it is to support communities to reduce vulnerability to shocks and stresses and to build assets and capabilities. For some of our communities, that might include preparing for sudden onset hazards or shocks, but we also are very committed to building broader resilience to all forms of shocks and stresses that may affect individuals and communities we work with. We very much consider resilience building to be a process and indeed a long-term commitment to the communities we work with. We bring together community, national and international volunteers to work with communities, organisations, government and the private sector to bring about positive, sustainable change. I have had the privilege in my role to work alongside some amazing communities and community volunteers. In Uganda, community volunteers brought together their communities to work on building resilience to underlying stresses, particularly focusing on drought and recurrent diseases. They ensured the inclusion of the most vulnerable in planning processes and brought local knowledge, inspiration and innovation to create effective resilience action plans. In Sierra Leone, we've got community volunteers who are active in disaster preparedness. They support their communities to implement action plans, for example, supporting the reduction of the impact of flooding through community cleaning days, setting up community drama groups to promote behaviour change. And during the flood response in 2019 in Freetown, they were the first on the scene. They put their community preparedness plans into action and were strong advocates for their community needs throughout the responsive recovery process. Our topic today is very timely. We're in the midst of the COVID pandemic in circumstances where we've seen a huge interest in volunteering. We've seen many informal and mutual aid groups set up, and in some cases, we've seen them filling gaps where government services have been overwhelmed by the challenges. But I will now hand over to Alice and Bianca to take us through their paper today. So Alice Chadwick is a doctoral researcher at the University of Bath. Her research is focusing on the role of volunteering within development projects in Sierra Leone and how this interacts with employment and citizenship. And indeed, her experience of volunteering and in research is adding greatly to this area. Bianca Fadel is a doctoral researcher at the Centre for International Development at Northumbria University in the UK. Her research is focusing on identity and belonging in local volunteering experiences during protracted crises, particularly in the case of Burundi. And she's bringing her policy-focused experience and her engagement with local youth engagement to this work. So Alice and Bianca, I hand over to you and look forward to hearing your presentation. Just one more reminder to everybody, please do add your questions as we go along, and we'll come to those after the presentation.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and hello, everyone. This is Bianca, and thanks very much, IAVE and the Emirates Foundation for hosting us today, and also for having supported this piece of work that Alice and I will briefly present to you now. And as Sarah has already mentioned, you have probably already received the PDF of the full paper. So what we will try to do now is actually to highlight just the main points for our discussion. So as an introduction, I would just say that in our research, we found that when volunteering builds on existing social practices and community structures, it can then foster resilience to crisis and sustain development over time. Also, I think it's very clear for all of us, and we know that we have participants here from many different countries attending this webinar now, that what we have seen over the past few months of COVID-19 is exactly how communities around the globe come together to support each other at times of crisis, be it through formal organizations, but also informally.
Thank you, Bianca. This is Alice, and I'm just going to briefly outline how we're going to structure our presentation today. So there are going to be four main parts. Firstly, we're going to try and unpack what the term resilience means. It's a term that we probably a lot of us have heard, and like maybe thinking a bit more about what it might mean in different contexts, and also challenging some of the assumptions around the use of the term. Then in the second part, we're going to look at the connection in this theme between resilience and community volunteering, trying to see how those are related, how they interact with each other, and kind of putting forward a framework for understanding the relationship. And then the third part, we're going to look at some practical case studies. So we have an example from Bangladesh, which is actually of the COVID-19 response of community-based youth volunteers. And also an example from Burundi, from the Burundi Red Cross. And there are further examples in our paper, so do go and have a full read to look at those. And then the final part, we're going to highlight the key issues and takeaways from our paper to provide the basis for the panel discussion and also hopefully questions from the audience. So please do type your questions into the chat so that they can be taken into consideration in the discussion.
Thanks, Alice. So we want to start by discussing a little bit what resilience means in theory, but also how this concept has been used in the practice. So in simple terms, as you can see here on the slide, we understand resilience as this capacity of individuals and communities to survive, learn, and grow stronger from difficulties. Well, but resilience today has also become a bit of a buzzword that we can see all the time in reports and projects and frameworks and so on. So it's important for us here to keep in mind that the term resilience in itself does not even have a translation in every language. And this is why we emphasize the need to question a little bit further what resilience really means. You can probably see many question marks in this slide, and that's okay. Sometimes the questions we ask are even more important than the answers we get. But I guess that's probably also easier for both of us as researchers to say that. So the first question is, resilience of whom? In the different definitions, we see resilience interpreted from different perspectives, such as individuals, households, and communities. But we also see that more dominant narratives often push for us to think of the poor or the vulnerable as those that need to be resilient. So we must be careful to understand resilience not as a precondition, but rather as this evolving ability of learning and growing that I mentioned before. The second question is, resilience against what? Current studies and even the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, often relate resilience to the context of disasters and big shocks, such as the current pandemic, for example. This is obviously very important, as we know, but we also want to signal the need to discuss resilience in the face of ongoing threats and underlying vulnerabilities, such as poverty, lack of education, and healthcare. So here we are talking about resilience both against disasters and everyday uncertainty. The final question before we move to the conversation on community-based volunteering is resilience for which purpose? And here again, it is important to reflect about the burden that often comes with resilience in terms of placing the responsibility on individuals and communities. The point is that resilience is actually more than bouncing back and returning to the same state previous to a crisis, for example. We are now very conscious that COVID-19 is changing our reality for good. So as we see here on the slide, this is why we need to understand resilience as this ongoing process of power shifting, as Sarah mentioned before as well, learning and adapting to change that leads to a constant transformation in directions that are important for all of us.
Thanks, Bianca. Can we go to the next slide? So now I'm unfortunately going to pose another question, but that is, what is the connection between resilience and community volunteering? There is a lot of exploration of what resilience looks like, and as Bianca's just outlined some of the key arguments and areas of concern around that, but there's also gaps in our understanding of how actually resilience can be developed and supported. What we are suggesting is that local community-based volunteering, which builds upon existing social structures and practices, can strengthen resilience and now allow communities to develop beyond crisis. Within this, we're defining community-based and local volunteering quite broadly as volunteering undertaken by and amongst those identifying as the same community. Volunteering in its broadest sense can be a way of understanding how people take action and ownership of development efforts and respond to crisis through leadership embedded in local knowledge. It can be a sign of agency and decision-making from within communities, which expresses key aspects related to resilience, agency, leadership, and self-organizing. However, a danger emerges here around community volunteering becoming a kind of policy prescription or a kind of label that's attached to different projects and initiatives. But rather what we're suggesting is that volunteering can be a unifying term to describe a range of ways in which people voluntarily support each other and contribute to development, which can lead to increased resilience. And one of the examples we look at in our paper is how communities responded to the Ebola crisis in Sierra Leone, and how it was when local volunteers came together and developed their own approaches to addressing the crisis that the disease was able to be combated the best. So people volunteering in their own communities, whether they call that volunteering or not, and as we know with resilience, not all of these terms translate into different languages and also understood in different ways. And when they are leading development agendas and efforts in unique and context-dependent ways, this is where the relationship between community volunteering and resilience can lie. So then the question emerges of what other actors, institutions, agencies, and organizations can do. What we're suggesting is what we're calling supportive solidarity. At its heart, this means listening and understanding existing community-based models of social support and volunteering, and learning from those affected about what types of support could amplify and strengthen existing efforts and agendas. And if we can go to the next slide, we're now going to apply this framework to a couple of case studies. So the first case study we're going to look at is the role of youth clubs against COVID-19 in Bangladesh. So community volunteer youth clubs have been supported through online platforms to access accurate and up-to-date information about the coronavirus disease and how to protect themselves from it, which they then use to design their own locally led responses. So VSO's youth programs have provided support for community-based youth clubs, which were pre-existing structures, and in the current crisis, these existing structures have been supported with this accurate information through the access to technology and online training, which has allowed young volunteers to carry out sensitization and awareness raising within their communities in ways that are important to local community members. And if we go to the next slide now, I'll pass over to Bianca.
Thanks, Alice. So following on the example from Bangladesh, the second example here that we want to bring is the example of income generation initiatives facilitated by the Burundian Red Cross. Burundi is a country in East Africa that has been facing political and economic challenges for many years now. So these initiatives started when local groups of community-based volunteers at the Burundi Red Cross came together to identify their own needs and potential ways of creating sustainable sources of income. So upon an initial mapping, these needs are scaled up by the organization to seek for external partners that could help setting this up with initial funding. The important thing here, which is key in our supportive solidarity model that Alice has just explained, is that these initiatives don't make individuals dependent, but rather they promote a sustainable livelihoods approach because they are conceived and then fully managed by local volunteers. As you can see in these pictures on the slide, these are some concrete examples of income generation initiatives. So these are volunteers producing and selling flour, volunteers managing small food shops, mostly in urban areas of Burundi, and then also volunteers accessing cows, pigs, or goats in rural communities. So these are very context-specific initiatives that can take up many forms and are now seen in many different areas of the country, in the case of Burundi. So we are very keen to hear also from the panelists in this discussion and from the participants during questions and answers about other potential examples of supportive solidarity.
Okay, so we now move to the key issues and takeaways so that we can have some good time for discussion from the panel. So the first key issue we identified is caution in labelling resilience. And I think Bianca outlined a lot of the issues around this earlier on in the presentation, but we're suggesting there needs to be caution in the use of the term and a need to engage with issues of power and responsibility in efforts to amplify local ownership. So volunteering and community resilience also need to be viewed in relation to the social and historical factors that lead to differing capacities and inequalities between and within communities. And I attended a webinar recently run by the New Humanitarian, which was around I think the title was When the West Falls into Crisis. And the writer and cartoonist based in Nairobi, Patrick Gathara, posed a question which said, we shouldn't be building resilience, we should be removing the reason why we say people need resilience. And I think this is a really interesting way of capturing that maybe resilience to crisis isn't what people want, but more a change to the conditions, which means that they are the ones who are constantly impacted by crises. And this feeds into this idea of transformation that we tried to pick up on in the earlier part of the presentation and paper. The second key issue concerns the framework of supportive solidarity and how to enhance it. And this could take the form of direct financial support for community-led initiatives, creating linkages and networks beyond community-based volunteers and national and international sources of solidarity and partnership. Or it could involve amplifying community leadership by creating platforms for dialogue with other actors to discuss development priorities and assign responsibilities. But the key here is that local ownership is not a substitute for the roles and responsibilities of other actors and service providers. There needs to be a balancing and integration of different responsibilities, dialogue between government, local and community stakeholders, acknowledging the interconnectedness of community development challenges. Community, we use this term a lot, but it's not an isolated unit. It's embedded in a much broader social system. So development challenges and crises and who is most impacted by them are a product of that interconnection. And I'll now pass over to Bianca to talk about the other two key issues.
Thanks, Alice. So the final two key issues and takeaways here, first are related to volunteering within and beyond the Sustainable Development Goals agenda. So many of us have probably been involved in the conversations around the plan of action to integrate volunteering into the 2030 agenda over the past few days and months. And the SDGs are certainly the main global framework for development conversations today. But we also need to recognize that the language of the SDGs is not always part of everyday community volunteering in many different contexts, and that volunteers are doing more than just delivering services. As we have shown, they're also leading and designing local action that is context specific. So beyond implementing the SDGs, volunteers are out there every day supporting communities to overcome local challenges, become more resilient, and shape their own development agendas and future and hope. So this leads to the final key issue here, which is the need for further research that engages with local volunteers and looks at their different roles in supporting community resilience. We note here the lack of qualitative evidence, especially from the Global South, and also the importance of involving community members and volunteers themselves as much as possible in research, not only as participants, which is often the case, but also in co-design and co-analysis that can allow them to influence research in participatory ways. Volunteer leaders, for example, can be involved as co-researchers or advisors in collaborative committees that can be formed at the start of a research project. So this kind of applied research is very important to build the body of evidence that we need to improve our knowledge on volunteering. So I'll pass now to Alice for some final reflections in conclusion.
Thank you, Bianca. So to provide some kind of final summarizing remarks, which will hopefully ignite some response from our distinguished panel members who will follow on from us. We're thinking about resilience as an ongoing process of change and transformation. Volunteers and communities are resilient regardless of whether they are labelled as such. Maybe what we need to move towards is a transformation of a system that means that some communities and groups are required to be more resilient than others. Volunteers are shaping their community's development in context-specific ways and leading change. And it needs to be them who's deciding what change and progress looks like. And finally, there's a potential and opportunity to further challenge power structures. Communities can start engaging networks and organisations to support the initiatives that they design and lead through platforms for supportive solidarity and connection. An initiative in one area can provide support and resources it requires to make their community development project happen, with success defined by those who are leading and impacted by it. So finally, I want to thank the ERV and the Emirates Foundation for the opportunity to present today and for me and Bianca to write this paper. And I'm excited to hear what the other distinguished panel members think about it, and also some questions and response from the audience as well. Thank you to Sarah also for moderating the following discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alice and Bianca. I am sure there are an awful lot of questions that are going to be out there to follow up on such an interesting presentation. So I'm going to ask our panelists to give a quick, quick reflections on that before I ask them a few questions. And then we will open to questions from the floor. So I just encourage you, I know I've seen a few great questions coming through our chat function. Please do keep sending those through, and we will come to those shortly. So our panelists today are Mara Basanovic, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Volunteering Queensland and has over 13 years of experience in leading volunteering efforts in Australia's two largest states. Recently, she's been leading a team to explore and implement impactful, locally led approaches to community capability and resilience building in disasters. And then we have Abdulla Shehhi, who holds a senior strategic role as Chief Operating Officer within Dubai Cares, which is a philanthropic organisation committed to breaking the cycle of poverty through education. He's also responsible for the fundraising process, and evaluating the performance and impact of programmes, directing the communications department, and involved in the community engagement function. So I am sure both Mara and Abdulla are going to have some great reflections for us. So I'm going to ask Mara and Abdulla, please, to turn on your cameras. Maybe Mara, if you would like to start with some reflections.
Yes, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Wendy, previously. And hello, everybody. I'd like to also thank Bianca and Alice for, a really fascinating paper. Resilience certainly has been at the core of what we've been doing in Queensland, in Australia. I suppose for the past 5 years, certainly in Queensland when I've been involved there. We work in resilience at times of peace and at times of disaster as well. So Volunteering Queensland is probably best known for its work in disasters through its online platform and program in looking at spontaneous volunteers. So in Queensland, the state government has got a very holistic kind of approach where it involves both not-for-profit organisations plus government agencies at all levels, and we work together in different areas of disaster response and recovery and preparedness. So we have formal arrangements under the within the Queensland government, and where Volunteering Queensland is pretty much responsible for spontaneous volunteers, and then working with the more formal agencies in the disaster area. So we have an online platform where we pre-register volunteers, and they're kind of spontaneous volunteers, I suppose. So that program is called EV Crew, and it's just emergency management and then community response to extreme weather. Queensland is the most disaster prone state in Australia, although during this last year, I know the whole world was looking at New South Wales and Victoria and South Australia with the devastating fires, but the fires did come up to Queensland. So some of our staff went and worked down there in New South Wales with the community, looking at some models that we've been developing over the past years. And those models are more around community capability building and the building capability building of local councils. I'm sure it would be very similar around the world, but the cost of disasters, the frequency, the intensity, the devastation that they cause seems to be never ending in Australia. The last 2.5 years, we've gone from one disaster to another, monsoonal floods, fires, then cyclones, and overlaying all of that is drought. So we've been kind of in constant just flip-flopping from one to another without very much of a break. And the thing that's come to our attention, and we were funded quite, we've been funded quite consistently to look at. We cannot keep flying people in. Australia is very large. Everything's very expensive here. We can't keep flying people into communities that perhaps can't accommodate for them. The communities have been impacted by disaster, so they're not ready for support. Then the supports comes at a time when perhaps the community is not ready either, because the community is in shock and is trying to just come to terms with it. So we took kind of one step back and looked at how are we going to actually manage disasters going forward, given rising costs, and also that really the two fundamental principles that we work with are it's about the community. It's not about the volunteer. It's not about organisations coming in, it's the community first, and of course do no harm. And so what we find with community or self-activating volunteers and also spontaneous volunteers is often the desire to help does not necessarily put the community first. So there is sometimes harm caused, and it's definitely not intentional. There's great will and there's great capacity to help. But what we work more is about a coordinated approach and everybody kind of working together and knowing one another within that. So actually working on local capability and local champions to lead the volunteering effort in their own communities is something that we're very much sort of pushing. So during COVID-19 certainly has changed, as Alice and Bianca have said, have changed the way that we've been speaking. And when I was, we've been working, so, and when I was listening to the presentation, I was thinking about in Queensland and Australia, we did a whole lot of surveys and some research, and we have had over 80% of our volunteer involving organisations, the more formal ones, stand down their volunteers, and more than 50% of those stood down all of their volunteers. And a lot of volunteers who certainly were of an age that was considered to be more vulnerable, i.e. the over 60s, over 70s, those volunteers and those people within our communities were told to self-isolate. So, volunteering is very important for people. It's their raison d'etre, their reason for being in a lot of ways, and their purpose in life. And also people of all ages have got something to give. So it was very difficult for a lot of volunteers to actually be stood down. But what we're finding also now is that it actually, because it's still such an uncertain time and COVID keeps coming and going, that a lot of volunteers are actually quite reluctant to go back as well. They don't feel safe. And so we're finding that community volunteers are stepping forward, and they were actually the saviour of our communities. When there were lockdowns, people just went out and helped. They had compassion, they had kindness, they had caring. They knew that no one else would be able to help the older and more vulnerable people in our community, and so they actually went out and in their local neighbourhoods and supported one another and formed very strong connections. Sorry, is that the 5 minutes?
So sorry, Mara. Can I come back to these comments in our discussion? Would you mind?
Sure. No, not at all. I'm sorry.
No, not a problem. Really interesting. I think really interesting. Thank you so much. Can I ask Abdulla, would you like to make a few sort of short reflections on what we've heard so far?
Of course. Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you for the distinguished delegation also on the panel here. And thanks for IAVI and Emirates Foundation for giving me the opportunity to be part of this special online series and forum. I would like actually to start from what Bianca and Alice has started with defining resilience and community resilience especially. They define it as capacity of individuals and communities in surviving, learning, and growing stronger from difficulties. And this is basically the mandate of Dubai Cares, where we build the individual and the community's capacity by empowering them through education. And this is what we have been done since 2007, since the establishment of Dubai Cares, and our footprint has reached to 59 countries across the globe. So if you allow me, I would like to give some reflection of some sort of activities that has been done within the UAE and outside the UAE in terms of community resilience. And if you allow me also to add one definition to one term to the definition which was presented in the paper, which is adaptation. Adaptation is very important when it comes to community resilience, because adaptation and quick adaptation is also the key. It's very important for communities and individuals to adapt to those difficulties quickly, and in order for them to survive and learn and also come out of these difficulties as soon as possible. And this is what we have noticed across the globe when it comes to the pandemic of COVID-19. I will give some examples of the UAE response and how adapted they can become on the pandemic. For example, the e-learning, when the schools were shut, schools and universities has moved to online learning, and the entire community of the UAE has worked together and adapt to this new way of teaching, which is online teaching. This is something that we haven't seen before, especially when it comes to school education, maybe in university and other level of schooling, yes, but when it comes to the early schools like primary education, secondary and higher school, that was something new for our in our region, and the community adopted very quick and fast on that note. We have heard a lot of countries has stopped or suspended education because of COVID-19, but we as Dubai, as UAE, had continued doing the education through online learning as well and distance learning. And UAE had launched several initiatives and projects just to support that initiatives to make sure that the education is not disrupted. Another field which UAE also had focused during the pandemic was the health and the food security for the entire nation, not only for the locals also. So there is a lot of volunteers who have participated in supporting the frontline heroes in terms of supporting them with manpower, screening, data analysis, and data entry as well in terms of follow-up. We have introduced a lot of virtual volunteering activities as well to make sure that the safety of our volunteers are taken care of as well in terms of priority and also delivering the message as well. So that's my 2 cents in terms of community resilience. It's very important to adapt and adapt quickly as well for such difficult times.
Thank you so much, Abdulla. That's really, really helpful insight. Can I ask Alice and Bianca to also turn on your videos, and maybe all of our panel members can do so now. Thank you very much. While we get started with our first question, we do have a quick poll that we are going to ask you to complete. And Jessica, I'm going to ask if you can share that. It's not quite working on my screen. So while we are getting into our first question and getting ourselves organised, we'd like to ask you to very quickly give your initial thoughts around which of the following ideas you first associate with community resilience. So if I could ask you just very quickly to give your first thoughts, just give you a couple of seconds to do that. And while you're doing that, the other request is we're getting some really good questions coming through. I ask you to keep sending those through to us. I'm very excited to see how our panelists challenge them to answer some of these questions. Fantastic. I can see the numbers in our poll are still going up, so I'll give it just a little minute and then we will close the poll. Okay, giving you 5 more seconds just to put in any last answers, and then we will close the poll. All right, so I have just seen that really great answers, lots going up and down, and really interestingly, I'm not sure, Jessica, if you're able to share the results with, wonderful, with everybody. So we can see that really for all of us here today, we're talking about, there are 2 things which are standing out as being the sort of main ideas which we associate with community resilience. And we've talked a little bit about this already, that ownership by communities of their own resilience and taking things forward, alongside partnerships. It's not something which communities can do necessarily by themselves. And that idea of leading into transformation. So that's really interesting and really useful. And I'll ask our panelists to perhaps reflect on that as we go into our questions. And I think it was really interesting what we've heard so far. And I wanted to first of all ask our panelists probably the big question in the room, The COVID-19 pandemic has really caused countries to focus a lot more on community resilience, and we've seen a huge increase in volunteering in sort of supporting communities. How are we going to be able to sustain this enthusiasm and passion for volunteering going forward? And I know, Mara, I cut into your response earlier, so I don't know if you want to come in first on that one.
Sorry, certainly. Sarah, you're talking in terms of community helpers or self-activating volunteers, rather than, because in formal volunteering, we found that some organisations went up, but a lot went down, and a lot still haven't come back in Australia. Whereas, as I was saying before, the actual saviour of our community were the community helpers or the self-activating volunteers who just went out and got on with the job. So there's a lot of resistance to them by some more formal organisations about their lack of I suppose their lack of structure, their lack of protection of their volunteers, but they really were the ones who saved our community. So our take in Queensland is that we need to embrace them, but also to be able to will that be the new way of volunteering in the future? I think it's such a growing movement. It's going to be a very important part of volunteering in the future. But while people are getting there, we're looking at providing information that we don't have a solution to the insurance side or the protection side, but we can give learning tools, we can give advice, we can invite them to come to and work with us when they get to the point where it becomes too large. We've had some groups where they're 15, 20,000 people and they're just finding it difficult to manage those. So I think it's up to us in the more sort of traditional areas of volunteering to reach out and to embrace, especially the young people who are coming through and doing the community helpers, and really make room for them and work together.
Fantastic, thank you, Mara. Would any other of our panelists like to come in on that question?
I think if I may just add a few words, like from the experience as a volunteer myself, I think that feedback is really important, and feeling that volunteers are involved in the processes, and that we are heard and that we are listened to during programming and planning for the longer term. I think this is something key to sustain this momentum that we are seeing now because of the pandemic throughout a longer period of time.
Thank you very much. And Abdulla, did you want to add something on that one?
Yes, if I want just to add, and related to the poll which has just made by our audience, leadership and partnership, that's very important. Whenever there will be always a leadership within the community who everybody will look up to and be a role example and model for all the volunteers, the momentum will still continue. The partnership is very important between the volunteers and also the organization, that they are providing services for them. As Bianca said, the feedback, the back and forth, two-way communication between both entities is very important as well.
Fantastic. Thank you all very much. I think as we move forward, both through the pandemic and hopefully eventually afterwards, it will be great to see how we can, as we say, sort of harness some of this enthusiasm. Really great. So another question I have here is, obviously with community volunteering, there may be some challenges sometimes in ensuring that there is equal opportunity for everybody to be involved in our projects. So how can we encourage inclusion and equal opportunity when we're looking at community-based volunteering? Are there particular groups who struggle, for example, maybe women who may have less free time due to family obligations, or Indigenous groups? How are we sort of taking that forward? And Alice, I don't know if you wanted to come in on that one?
Yeah, definitely. So I think this is a really key area that you picked up on. And I think part of it's around how volunteering is framed and me and Bianca have had conversations around this. It's not necessarily like volunteering is a full-time thing that people are doing, and thinking about how the time ask of volunteering, and also like when that time is, and that obviously being appropriate for the types of groups that you're trying to involve. But I think another aspect of it is thinking about inclusion from the aspect of groups who are already advocating in communities and within different societies and cities around the world for the inclusion of women and other groups, and trying to see how organizations and who are trying to support these efforts can provide support to those groups who are already doing that kind of advocacy work at that level in a more kind of context dependent way, I guess.
Fantastic, thank you. Would anybody else like to come in on that one?
May I just make a point about what we've noticed is we've had something called the Care Army, where people have actually registered to deliver support, and we actually interestingly saw a rise in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander participation, and certainly a real diversity of volunteers across the whole spectrum of our society. So it was very, very interesting to look at, you know, when it came and when it was community owned and locally driven, it was about immediate need. The other thing that we found in COVID, which is different, is that everyone was home. So people had lots of time. So we didn't have that normal picture of disaster volunteering where you get a huge spike in people wanting to volunteer, but and then they go back to their normal lives. Here, people have been sitting at home for an awful long time. And so their eagerness to volunteer has been really something that we've been trying to capitalize on and to meet that expectation.
Yeah, I think that's been a big, really interesting challenge. As people have been at home, they've been really keen to get out and get volunteering. And actually, in the UK, I think we're sort of seeing that shift backwards now. People are having to go back to work. And how do we maintain some of the support that's still very much needed, particularly for those who are still shielding as we move forward in this process. But actually, we've got a question, and I'm going to perhaps take the moderator's initiative and start merging some of our prepared questions and questions from our audience. We've had a question from Kelly around actually whether does volunteering actually help to remove barriers to participation. And I know we talked about youth in the presentation, but I don't know if Bianca, do you want to come in on that, and how does that actually help reduce the barriers to participation if we talk about volunteering?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. So thanks for the question. I think this is really important in terms of understanding how inclusive any volunteer programs are, if we're talking about formal involvement of volunteers, obviously through organizations or associations. And I think that a bit building upon what Alice has just mentioned before, there needs to be this consciousness in terms of time commitment and expectations from both sides. And I think this is really key to allow everyone that has this willing to engage to actually perform volunteer work. And I think the communication barrier is the first one that I would acknowledge, because sometimes it's very difficult as a volunteer, again talking myself from my own experience, to get through the systems and to find a person with whom we can actually talk and engage to make sure we are listened to. So I think this would be some initial thoughts on that.
Great, thank you very much. Now, we've had a couple of questions coming through around building agency of communities and balancing that with the role of the state and sort of our duty bearers or our local government and indeed formal volunteering organisations. So how do we, Chris is coming in, Chris, Leah and Tammy have all sent in questions around this. How do we support community volunteering while also ensuring that government and others are delivering the duties and they don't see volunteers as stepping in as a cheap way of filling that obligation? And also, how do they then support our formal volunteering organisations to create a system of sort of mutual sort of trust and support among all of our stakeholders involved. Who might like to start us off on that one? Bianca's nodding at me, so I might pick on you to jump back in and start, if that's all right.
Sure. Yes, just like maybe to get us going on this. Yes, I think this again is a really key question about the political use of volunteers sometimes, as well, as we have seen in many occasions, and the fact that we need to understand resilience not as this burden over the poor or the vulnerable or those that are actually facing challenges, but eventually moving forward and getting through this idea of collaboration, really. So again, I think key here is communication and collaborations that are built in a horizontal way, not looking at volunteers simply as those delivering services, which is often the case, as we see in programming and many studies, that like volunteers are not only the ones like at the front line delivering the services, but actually they need to be consulted and engaged throughout the whole process. So I think this is really key to avoid the idea of volunteers as a cheap form of labor. And again, the debates around the stipends and everything that has to go with the remuneration of volunteering. This is a really huge debate, and how we can connect that to the idea of building sustainable livelihoods is also key. Instead of avoiding this conversation, we should actually be having these debates, but from a different perspective, I would say.
Thank you very much. And I know, Abdulla, you've been talking about adaptation earlier. And does this sort of collaboration and working together, is that one way in which, particularly, I guess, as we've been talking about, the way that we've seen a surge of maybe spontaneous volunteers and maybe our formal organisations struggling a bit more, does that fit within what you're talking about around adaptation?
Absolutely, Sarah. Adaptation is very important, especially when it comes to both formal and non-formal volunteering as well. I truly believe in unification of efforts, unification of resources is the key here. Informal volunteering has been ongoing for a long time now within our communities. However, having an overarching formal volunteering is very important, to unify the resources and efforts as well. Eventually, it's an ultimate goal that both organizations would like to achieve by the end of the day. But when they collaborate together, amplification of their impact is much, much higher.
Fantastic. Alice, do you want to come in?
Yeah, there was just something I wanted to add, and I think it kind of relates more to the second part around how like formal volunteer organizations engage with the kind of existing informal volunteering and spontaneous volunteering. I guess a way of kind of rethinking about it is that volunteering is going to be happening whether the formal organization decides to come in and support or engage with it or not. So thinking about people responding to crises within their own communities, mutual aid. So the kind of question I think from the formal organization side is, this is already happening, how can we amplify and further support this work when it's going to be happening anyway, but maybe we have a role in terms of our access to resources, networks and government that can amplify what's already happening.
Yeah.
Fantastic. And Mara, I was going to ask you to come in, but there's been another follow-up question around how does that engage with also corporate volunteers coming in? So I don't know if you maybe want to add your thoughts and maybe touch on that as well. Sorry, I think you're on mute.
Sorry. I certainly agree that like communication and understanding of what's in place already and then building on that is really quite critical. But once people know, they know where to come in and help. With corporate volunteering is quite big in Australia, and there's certainly that desire to help. But we notice that, first of all, corporates want to be on the ground a lot more than just through skilled volunteering or not so skilled volunteering. It's been interesting through COVID because even very large companies are struggling to refine where they're starting and how they're continuing their business. And so we had over 5,000 corporate volunteers register, but actually we've used very few because it's unknown, the risks and the dangers in insurance and all of those things that corporates absolutely have in place, the good management, volunteer management structures and things like that. They can't actually kind of see where they fit in with that. So they've been doing quite sort of safe activities, but very, very powerful ways of giving where real need was happening. You know, going out and working with children with technology. Abdulla mentioned looking at virtual use of virtual volunteering, you know, basic sort of food and survival things as well. But it has been interesting with corporates. The interest is there, but actually getting the bodies on the ground has been a bit more problematic for companies to find where they can safely put or they feel they can safely put their employees.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting challenge and one we need to keep thinking about, definitely. We've had a couple of other questions come through from Carolina and from Maria around how we measure the impact of volunteering and sort of how important this is for sort of policy making. And Alice, I don't know if you want to start us off on that one.
Yeah, this is always the big question in volunteering, isn't it? How to measure its impact. I think I would probably, and this is probably the sort of researcher inside me, put a bit of a kind of caution around that, just in terms of what we're thinking about impact. Is it the impact for who? Because I think there's a lot of focus in research on the impact of volunteering on volunteers themselves in terms of their motivations and their kind of like life trajectories afterwards. So maybe the kind of focus around impact, and I think this links to the idea of ownership as well in terms of how impact is defined in kind of ways that are relevant to people impacted by the project. So that it does include the volunteers, especially when we're talking about that kind of community-based volunteering where volunteers are often in very similar positions to those that they're trying to support. But yeah, I'm going to kind of skirt answering that one by saying we need to first define what we mean by impact and who it's for.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with Alice. And if I can add, Sarah, to that, just like the importance of overcoming quantitative only tools for measurement, because we see a lot on reports, again, on studies, how volunteering is quantified most of the time in comparison to economic labor, right? So it's obviously a tool for policymakers to showcase the impact, but it's definitely not the only and most of the time not the ideal way of explaining how volunteers, especially here we're talking about like community-based volunteers, are doing their work in an everyday basis. So the importance of coupling these like quantitative tools with qualitative storytelling tools that we can actually try and reach people on the ground and hear their stories. I think everyone here and many participants will probably have volunteering experiences themselves. So the importance of finding tools that can acknowledge that and can build on this human relationship that we know volunteering is all about. Thanks.
Fantastic. Abdulla, I don't know if you want to come in on that because I know you're involved in measuring impact.
It's the $1 million question. Nobody has answered for that question. I just would like to comment on what Alice says. It is very difficult to measure it. Is it on you? Is it on the beneficiary? Is it on your colleague that is helping you and you're dealing with? I will just simple answer that question is whatever impact that you feel with. It is something that self-motivation is something that just think about it. We have run a lot of activities throughout the year, and it involved different sectors of the community. And because we are a small organization, we rely on our staff to come and help us as team leaders. And sometimes they just lead a group of volunteers to paint a mural on the wall. And I asked them after that, would you like to volunteer again? They said, absolutely. I said, why? Because he said, first of all, I'm doing something good for the children who come next day in the school and see this beautiful mural. But in the same time, I'm also learning some managerial skills, supervisory skills as well. So I am also developing my skills, me as a human as well, in terms of leading those group of volunteers. So it is a two-way communication. It is a partnership between you, your colleague, your end beneficiary. Impact is the way that you feel whatever impact or thing that you have done to the beneficiary and yourself as well.
Fantastic. And Mara, do you want to come in on that one at all?
I know, I think Abdulla described it really well, but we find it hard to find a consistent measure. Everybody values volunteering in a different way and measures the impact in a different way. So in Australia, we've got to come to some kind of agreement about how to do it first.
Yeah. Thank you all so much. And I have to say, there are more questions coming in. We could keep going, but I'm afraid we are going to be running quite short of time. So it has been really fantastic to hear all the input from all our panelists. Thank you so much for answering all of the questions. We've gone from the opportunities and challenges of Brexit to unpacking some of the bigger questions around impact. I think we've had a really wide-ranging discussion, so thank you for that. And thank you to everybody listening in who has been sending in your questions. It's been great to be able to see how much you've all obviously engaged with the content, so thank you all so much. So I'll ask the panelists if you wouldn't mind switching off your webcams again as we go back to our last few slides. Fantastic. So unfortunately, we have to bring the discussion to a close. But don't worry, there is more discussion yet to come. So looking to the future, this is obviously the first in the series of forums. So the next forum is coming up on the 9th of September. We're going to be looking at the role of youth volunteers and sort of what volunteering leadership looks like for them. So I would encourage you all to sign up. You can do so on the IAVI website. And finally, just to wrap up today, just sort of the next slide, we have been recording the session today, and that will be sent to you alongside the paper, which Bianca and Alice have been talking to today, and that will also be available online on the website there. So all we've been saying is thank you so much to everybody for joining us today. Thank you to IAVI and the Emirates Foundation for supporting this. And we look forward to seeing you all back here again in September. So all the best. Thanks now.